June 1943. A gray transport ship slides into Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. After 2 weeks at sea, hundreds of German prisoners lean over the railings, expecting punishment. They imagine barbed wire, barking guards, hard labor. Instead, the first thing they see is music. A brass band plays swing near the pier. Dock workers, white and black, move side by side, shouting to each other over the cranes. A woman in overalls operates a winch. Kids sell newspapers outside the gates. Nobody hides, nobody stares, and nobody seems afraid of them. Sergeant Hermann Buther, an officer from Rommel's Afrika Korps, writes later in his memoir that this was the first moment he felt confused, not captured. His world had been built on Nazi rules, on race, hierarchy, control. Yet here, those rules didn't seem to exist. Norfolk was the largest naval base on Earth, more than 4,000 acres of docks and warehouses. In one morning, it handled more cargo than Hamburg did in a week. But for the prisoners, the shock wasn't the size of the port. It was the freedom around it. Civilians walked near warships. Vendors sold coffee and donuts within sight of destroyers. The military seemed relaxed, almost casual, as if victory was already guaranteed. When the Germans were processed, another surprise came. American officers spoke to them in fluent German, reading out the Geneva Convention. They explained prisoners' rights, food rations, medical care, even religious diets. Some Jewish American soldiers distributed Red Cross packages and offered kosher meals for any Jewish POWs. The Germans laughed at first, thinking it was a cruel joke. It wasn't. The Americans were serious. Medical staff, including black technicians, treated German soldiers with the same new medicine, penicillin, that was still rare in Europe. To men trained to see race as destiny, this simple act of equality broke logic. In Germany, such contact would have been illegal. In America, it was just normal procedure. Their first meal on U.S. soil deepened the confusion. They were led into a mess hall where American sailors were already eating. Enemies who had tried to kill each other at sea now shared the same food line. The Americans barely looked up, too busy listening to a baseball game on the radio. For Butcher and the others, the message was silent but clear. This country wasn't trembling in war. It was living, loudly, freely, without fear. The shock wasn't in what they suffered, but in what they saw. A nation strong enough to be kind. The train rolled west through summer heat. Instead of dark boxcars, the German prisoners sat in real passenger coaches with soft seats and open windows. Guards walked the aisles calmly. No one shouted. At every stop, curious civilians gathered to watch. Kids waved. Women brought coffee. Some people even took photos. The Germans looked out the windows, stunned. America wasn't hiding its war machine. Factories stood in plain sight, names painted in giant letters. Glen L. Martin Aircraft, Alcoa, Bethlehem Steel. Parking lots were full of workers' cars. From the train, the prisoners could see rows of shiny new planes waiting for delivery. No camouflage, no secrecy, just open confidence. At one stop, in Washington, D.C., families crowded the platform to say goodbye to sons heading to training camps. Wives kissed soldiers openly. Teenagers shared milkshakes at the station diner. On the same platform, behind a few guards, stood the enemy, German soldiers, watching a scene that would have been impossible in their own country. In Nazi Germany, the state owned fear. Citizens whispered their opinions and trusted no one. Here, the prisoners heard farmers and factory workers complain about President Roosevelt right out loud, and nobody arrested them. Newspapers sold at the stations carried headlines that criticized the government, argued about strategy, even questioned how the war was being fought. The Germans didn't understand how a country could fight a global war and still allow disagreement. But that, more than anything, was America's strength, chaos that somehow worked. As the train moved through Pennsylvania, the prisoners saw the glow of steel mills lighting up the night sky. They passed neighborhoods of small houses, each with gardens, cars, radios, electric lights in every window. In Germany, most homes had been darkened for years under blackout orders. Here, the light never stopped. One memory stuck with many prisoners. At a station stop, they watched a factory worker finish half an apple, toss it away, and open a new one. The waste seemed unthinkable. In North Africa, men had fought over crumbs. Now they watched an ordinary American throw food away without a thought. By the time they reached Texas, the shock had settled into silence. They hadn't been beaten, humiliated, or starved. Instead, they had been allowed to see, to really see, a country that didn't need walls or fear to protect itself. For men trained to believe that freedom led to weakness, this was the most dangerous thing America could have shown them. Freedom that worked. When the Germans arrived in central Texas, they braced for the worst. They expected hard labor, tents, and punishment. Instead, they stepped into a camp with wooden barracks, electric lights, and hot water. Every building had flush toilets, clean sheets, and working showers. It wasn't luxury, but it was far beyond what most of them had even at home. Camp Hearne sat near a small town halfway between Houston and Dallas. It covered more than 700 acres and housed nearly 5,000 prisoners. Each man had a bed, a locker, and enough space to walk freely inside the compound. The rules were strict, but the tone was surprisingly human. The camp commander, Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Stiles, spoke fluent German. He explained that prisoners would elect their own representatives, organize sports, and manage daily schedules. That single announcement, self-government for enemies, left many speechless. Soon, life in the camp began to look less like a prison and more like a small town. There was a library, a recreation hall, and even a stage for concerts. American teachers from nearby colleges gave lectures on agriculture, math, and English. The camp newspaper, written in German, started out filled with Nazi slogans, but slowly turned into open discussions about democracy and life after the war. The canteen became the most unbelievable sight of all. Prisoners could buy chocolate, cigarettes, and art supplies using tokens they earned from voluntary labor. They even painted, played ping pong, and built small model airplanes from scrap wood. Outside the camp, Texas farms and factories were desperate for workers. German POWs picked cotton, repaired fences, and worked at oil mills and canneries. They earned 80 cents a day, the same pay as an American private. Working side by side with Mexican American and black laborers, they saw a kind of racial cooperation that Nazi propaganda had called impossible. And then came Christmas. The entire town of Hearne decided to give the prisoners a holiday celebration. Local churches sent food and gifts. School children wrote cards in German. One American mother, whose son was fighting in Italy, led her church choir in singing Silent Night for the enemy soldiers. That evening, under a 30-foot Christmas tree covered in electric lights, hundreds of men stood quietly, holding small wrapped presents. Many cried. Some prayed. For the first time, they felt that kindness could be stronger than victory. Camp Hearne wasn't meant to punish them. It was meant to show them what freedom looked like in simple, ordinary ways. And that lesson was starting to take root. At Camp Hearne, daily life kept challenging everything the German prisoners thought they knew about power and fairness. They were enemies in a time of war, yet they were treated better than many Americans outside the fence. Some guards were black soldiers from the segregated U.S. Army. For Germans raised on Nazi race laws, taking orders from a black man was unthinkable. A few even demanded transfers, requests that were calmly denied. Yet, when these same guards walked into town, some restaurants refused to serve them. The prisoners could sit inside, eat lunch, and enjoy coffee, while their guards, American citizens, had to use the side door. That contradiction didn't make sense to anyone. Out in the fields, the lines blurred even more. POWs picked cotton alongside Mexican American and black workers. They learned to share tools, trade jokes, and compete over who could fill sacks faster. One German later admitted that the experience broke something inside him, the idea that race determined a man's worth. The work itself was steady and organized. The prisoners noticed that American supervisors rarely shouted. Farmers gave clear directions. Then let people figure out the best way to finish the job. Efficiency came from trust, not fear. A strange idea for men trained in the discipline of the Wehrmacht. And everywhere there was conversation. Americans argued about politics, religion, and the war itself right in front of their prisoners. On one farm, a worker told a government inspector to go to hell over crop rules, and nothing happened to him. To the Germans, this was stunning. In their homeland, such defiance meant arrest or worse. In the camp itself, the Red Cross visited often, inspecting food, water, and medical care. Reports showed that German POWs were getting the same rations and health treatment as U.S. soldiers, sometimes even better. The food was plentiful, the hospital stocked with medicine, and the guards followed the Geneva Convention to the letter. All of this created quiet confusion. The prisoners began to debate among themselves. How could a country so loose, so full of argument and disorder, still be so strong? Slowly, they realized that strength didn't come from control. It came from freedom. By early 1944, conversations inside the camp had changed. The same men who once lectured others on Nazi discipline were now organizing study groups on democracy. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were learning how another kind of society worked, one where respect didn't have to be demanded, only shown. Camp Hearne had started as a prison. It was becoming a classroom. When Germany finally surrendered in 1945, the men at Camp Hearne waited to learn their fate. Many feared punishment or deportation to ruined cities. Instead, the Americans offered something else: education. The war was over, but the teaching wasn't. Classes expanded. Prisoners studied English, agriculture, and business. Professors from Texas colleges gave lectures on democracy and rebuilding. Thousands of Germans across America's 500 POW camps took part in the same programs. They learned how local government worked, how free markets operated, and how citizens could disagree without violence. At first, many didn't believe any of it would matter. But as news from home arrived, cities bombed, families starving, the lessons began to feel like preparation for a future they hadn't imagined. These students of freedom were being trained, quietly, to rebuild their country when they went home. Not all wanted to leave. Some had fallen in love with the open fields, the easy conversations, the rhythm of American life. After repatriation began, thousands applied to return. By the 1950s, around 5,000 former POWs had legally immigrated to the United States. Many became engineers, farmers, and teachers. Others stayed in Germany and helped shape the new democracy that would rise in the West. Records show how deep the change went. Surveys by occupation authorities found that nearly 3 out of 4 returning prisoners supported democratic reforms. Dozens became mayors, city council members, or business leaders. They brought home not just memories, but methods: teamwork over hierarchy, trust over fear. In 1984, 40 years after their capture, former Camp Hearne prisoners came back to Texas for a reunion. They walked the same grounds, now quiet and overgrown. They hugged their old guards, shared photos of families, and laid flowers at the American Legion Memorial. One of them, Fritz Zimmerman, spoke for the group. "We came as enemies," he said, "and we left as students of freedom." History often measures victory in battles won and enemies defeated. But the story of the German POWs in America shows a different kind of power: the strength to turn enemies into allies through fairness, patience, and simple decency. America's greatest victory wasn't won overseas. It happened here, behind barbed wire, where freedom proved its worth by living up to its own ideals. If this story moved you, give it a like, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe for more untold stories that show how humanity can win, even without a single shot.